Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at taking offence. What is it? Is it a good thing? And can it also go too far? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. It's sometimes said that we're living through an epidemic of taking offence. We have become hypersensitive, the story goes, to any slight against our sense of self-worth. And a generation of so-called snowflakes are told they just need to relax a little. But what does it actually mean to take offence? How does feeling offended fit in alongside all the other emotions that our social interactions might invoke, such as anger, indignation, or contempt? Is taking offence really such a bad thing, or might it, at least in some circumstances, actually have positive value? Well, the person who has thought about such questions more deeply than anyone else is Dr. Emily McTernan, Associate Professor in Political Theory in the UCL Department of Political Science. Emily is currently finishing a book to be published by Oxford University Press called On Taking Offence, and last year a version of the first chapter was published in article form in one of the top political philosophy journals. And I'm delighted to say that Emily joins me now. Emily, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And can you tell us first why you think the phenomenon of taking offence needs attention? You've pointed out that much has been written about causing offence, but that taking offence has been relatively neglected. Why is that a gap that needs to be filled?
Thank you for having me on. So I guess the reason I was drawn to write about taking offence is precisely that thought that there's some kind of epidemic of being a snowflake, or these having a propensity towards having hurt feelings, this oversensitivity that particularly the younger generation is being characterized as having. And the thought as well that there's this new and growing threat to our social relations by how sensitive people are, how much offense is being taken. And so I wanted to get clearer on what taking offense really is. So I think all of that is a radical mischaracterization of what's going on. So in two ways, I don't think offense is about hurt feelings at all. I think it's a reaction to an affront. And the other thing is, I don't think it's new. And I don't think it's a threat. So I think that all of us sometimes take offense in various social interactions. So where someone pushes past you in a queue, or grabs the last seat on the train just as you were reaching it, or your partner says your cooking is terrible. I think it's an incredibly ordinary and everyday kind of emotion. And so there's nothing new here, and I don't think there's anything threatening. And I think we'll probably talk a bit more about that as we go on. So I think it's really important to get the characterization right. And the work that has been done, and there's a lot of it in legal philosophy on causing offence, really hasn't helped this mischaracterization. So the most common popular view comes from Joel Feinberg, and because of what he's after, which is just a handle on something that the state might want to regulate over that's not to do with harm, he packs in any kind of disliked state that's wrongfully caused there, from annoyance to things that are genuinely offensive. And so that's not terribly helpful either.
Okay, so let's start off then with defining more tightly what taking offence actually is. How do you define what it means to take offence?
So I think there's three defining features of taking offence. So one is that you perceive or judge that there's been some kind of affront to your standing. So and your standing is, you think of it and as you're presenting it in this particular kind of interaction. So perhaps someone refuses to shake your hand, or someone snubs you, or says something rude, or just doesn't treat you with the kind of respect and consideration that you take yourself to be due here and now. Because of course that varies, right? What respect and consideration looks like in the workplace isn't the same as what it looks like in your friendship group, isn't the same as what it might look like in your household. And the second defining feature is that as a result of the other person having affronted how you think you should be treated, not treating you as you think you should be treated in terms of respect and consideration, you feel estranged from them. Now, that varies hugely, of course, right? Sometimes you're just momentarily taken aback, right? It can be very small. Sometimes you want to withdraw altogether from relations from that person for good. And I think because you think you've been affronted and you feel estranged, there's a third defining feature, which is you tend towards acts of withdrawal. You'll have this action tendency. So you'll want to pull away from that person and show them that you're pulling away in some way. But again, because I think this is such an ordinary and kind of everyday, non-catastrophic kind of emotion, I really want to draw attention to the fact that ordinarily when we're offended, we do things like leave a small and awkward pause in our conversation, or raise an eyebrow, or just not go with the flow and sort of make it awkward that they've said something or done something that you think is outside the realm of the norm, or you'll tut at the queue jumper. Those are acts of offence. Of course, sometimes we do things that are grander when we're offended. So we might also refuse invitations where the person might be present, break off friendships or other kinds of relationships, and so on.
You describe offence as an emotion,
Yes.
but it's also an action. Just where does the offence actually lie there?
Great. So this is very much about the kind of philosophy of emotions here. So what is an emotion, right? So I take it that they have a kind of a belief or perception part or a judgment part. People disagree over which exactly is going on, but there's something that we're responding to out there in the world, or something that's going on that the emotion is a reaction to. There's also a way it feels to have an emotion, and there's also what it tends to provoke us to do. So that might not be to act in the world, right? I might just withdraw and feel sad in myself, or fear, right? I mean, it does cause us to act in certain ways, but they're kind of, we might run away or something. So, but not always, right? So it's only an action tendency. So tend to be these kinds of things. Of course, we might repress our emotions or hide them, in which case we won't see the actions coming.
So I guess I'm intrigued about the idea of an emotion like feeling offended as sort of an object of moral valuation. If it's something that we don't have any control over, if it's an emotional reaction that we just have to things, then is it something to which we can attach moral values?
Great. So I think emotions have both moral and political value. Not all emotions, of course, and not all the time, but at least some of them. Anger is a popular one for philosophers to think about in this context. So the thought I have, because I come from a kind of virtue ethics-like framing, is that you can become disposed to notice the thing that provokes the emotion, or you can train yourself to be less sensitive to it. So you can come to care more about affronts that you're offered in the case of offence, or less. You can come to be more knowing about which kinds of affronts count and less knowing. So that's one area where you have some kind of control, right? The kind of propensity to feel the emotion. And you also, I think, have some control over the longer term in moderating your reactions when you do feel the emotion. So only toddlers completely give in to the full range, if you like, of the emotion, right? When they feel frustration, you can see that they're frustrated. It's completely without control. Of course, for adults, we expect certain kind of controlled responses to frustration. They still express their frustration, but they don't do it full-heartedly in the way that the toddler does. And so the thought is, likewise with any emotion, you can do some work on how you manifest it. And there'll be more or less appropriate ways to manifest it.
Okay, really interesting. So how does this emotion relate to other emotions? You've mentioned anger. You say a lot about contempt and shame, and a range of different emotions that you suggest are kind of circling around, if you like, in our discussion of offence.
I think there's sometimes been a tendency to assume that offence would be a part of anger. So one way we can express being angry is by being offended. And I think that's a slight mistake in the sort of placement amongst the emotions. So there's lots of disagreement about how to divide these up. But a really popular distinction is between other condemning emotions, so anger, disgust, contempt, and self-assessment emotions. So shame would be a kind of really clear example of that, right? Where I think it's about how I think about myself. And so I think there's sort of two things to note about offence as it's placing itself in amongst these other emotions. So one is that insofar as it's an other condemning emotion, it's much nearer contempt than it is anger. So anger is an emotion very much of engagement with the other. It's a negative kind of engagement, but it's an engagement. Contempt is an act of withdrawal from another. And then so is offence. It's a withdrawal, not an engagement. It doesn't push us towards, it pushes us away. The other funny thing about offence, the sense in which it's a really quite an unusual emotion, is the handful of psychologists that have been working on offence. Some of them think, and I think correctly, that to some extent offence is a self-assessing emotion. I think as well as another condemning emotion. So I think I'm both judging the act and saying it's not the right kind of act. I disapprove of that act, that affront that you've offered me, but I'm also assessing my own standing. So when you affront me, there'll be a moment where I think, is this a correct reading of my standing? Like, am I really worth that much less consideration and respect as this other person has manifested? Or am I in fact correct to think they should have treated me better? And so there's this moment where you think about yourself, about how you're presenting yourself, how others are responding to it. So I can see why it's sometimes called a self-assessment emotion, which again pulls it away from anger, which is not really about assessing oneself in the direct sense.
And is it the same, or is it different from things like indignation or affrontedness or resentfulness? Are there differences to be teased out there as well?
I think probably so. I think indignation is probably best understood as a form of anger, but a particularly kind of impartial, perhaps, form of anger or something like this. Resentment and offence, right. So they're probably quite close in some ways, but not all cases that you would feel resentment about are cases you'd be offended by. And not all cases of offence are cases where you would be resentful, I suspect. So they may often travel together, but I think not always. Partly because resentment is so closely tied to blaming someone. So I think if you resent someone, you're blaming them. Whereas I think actually we can be offended by, say, the sexist remarks of a very small child, but without blaming the child. So we don't resent the child for what they've said, but we might well be offended by what they've said. Likewise, a nice example maybe are some of the chatbots that have gone extremely wrong when confronted with what humans are like, when they try and learn from humans how to speak and then they say terribly offensive things. I think you could be offended, but you wouldn't really resent the chatbot, right? That would be sort of a basement of the emotion there.
Great. Okay, so we've got a sense here of what it is to be offended. Now, you argue that it can be good. This can be a good and valuable thing. Do you want just to lay out the argument for thinking that?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing I really wanted to... good is maybe one way of putting it that I wouldn't have necessarily chosen myself. I think one thing, what I think is that it might be socially valuable or socially important.
So I should just explain. I'm taking that phrase "good" from a little short kind of popular article, and that's the headline of the article is why taking offence is good.
Yes, one doesn't always choose these headings. I think.
Okay, so put it in better terms.
Yes, exactly. So I think socially important or socially valuable is really what I mean. I mean, good is a slightly funny way of thinking about it. But what I think is, obviously, it's not always. So offence clearly can be taken by people who have a massively inflated sense of what kind of respect they're due. So it's obviously not always good. But one thought I have is that it has this very important role to play in renegotiating social hierarchies. So there's a little bit of a story to get to why offence would come in. So here's the story in short form. So clearly our society is marred by all sorts of really unjust hierarchies based on class, on race, on gender, on sexual orientation, all manner of things. And one thing that's so troubling about these hierarchies, amongst other things, is that they're incredibly pervasive. So they'll keep popping up all over your life, right? You're not just treated as lesser in this setting, but also that one. So not only in education will there be implications of where you're placed in that hierarchy, but also when you go to the doctor, and also when you're on the street, and also when you're at a party, and also when you talk to the police. And so one thought I have about these hierarchies is that when you're thinking about them, one thing that matters in these hierarchies, one of the things that contributes to them, that keeps them going, is the ordinary, everyday things that we all do to keep sustaining them. So they don't come out of nothing, but we kind of constitute them all the time by these little acts. So I think there's a kind of ordinary patterning of these hierarchies. It explains why they get so pervasive, the ways in which our social norms and social practices keep reinforcing and recreating these hierarchies every time we encounter one another. So that's the kind of background story. That's why offence is going to come into play. And so the thought I have about taking offence is sometimes when some people take it, people who've been standardly marginalised or oppressed, who come lower down in these hierarchies, sometimes they're taking it in a way that draws our attention to the badness of these seemingly very minor on their own social norms and social practices, but that together make up this incredibly unjust state of affairs where there are these serious social hierarchies that have serious consequences for people's life chances, how things go for them. And so the thought I have is when you take offence as a member of one of these groups, sometimes what you do is you flag up that this way of treating people like you is not acceptable, that it's something to be resisted, that it treats you with less respect and consideration than you deem yourself to be due. And so I think what it can do then is resist the ordinary patterning of social unequal relations. Not always, of course, but sometimes. And I think that's really important. So I think it's important two ways. I think it draws your attention to the hierarchy, to the fact there are these norms here that are bad, that are contributing to bad hierarchies. And I also think it's not very nice when you offend someone. It really isn't. So it's very much a challenge to how you're presenting yourself in a social interaction to have offended someone. And so I think even those who are powerful are fearful of causing offence. It's not a good idea to cause offence. It affects one's own social standing in this setting. And so it's quite an effective form of resistance, even when there are power inequalities, because it's very because of the way that we don't like to have caused offence to others. Most of us, of course, some people love it, but the majority of us find it very socially difficult to have caused offence. And so the thought is that, so not only is it drawing attention to these patterns, to these hierarchies that we might not see otherwise, but also they resist it, and they resist it quite effectively, I think. People are very likely to be inclined not to say that kind of thing again. And people who see it are very likely to also avoid using that kind of language or whatever it is that has offended again.
So there's an effect there upon the offence causer. There's also an effect upon the person who is feeling offended, that they're able to kind of assert their value and their worth. And when you say it draws attention,
third parties as well. So
yes,
the interaction will also. So it's not, even if it doesn't work on the person who causes the offence, it may well work on, say, their colleagues who realise it's not probably the thing to do anymore.
Yes. And so that all makes a great deal of sense. I guess I was just thinking that it kind of feels like quite a lot of what gets criticised when people do start talking about snowflakes and all this kind of thing is that people are being kind of deliberately provocative and then being provoked. And that in some settings, if someone's being deliberatively provocative, are you better off? Are you more asserting your self-worth and your place in society if you're not offended, if you don't give in to the provocation, rather than if you do experience offence?
Great. So I would say, of course, sometimes it might be wiser to hide that you're offended. The other thing I think is really important with offence is to bear in mind kind of how subtly and cleverly it can be done. So, one thing you can do when you're offended is make it quite awkward for the other person in the conversation. So don't laugh at the joke. It's quite awkward, actually. You don't necessarily have to make it into the confrontation sometimes it's helpful to make it into a confrontation. Sometimes just manifesting a very subtle sign of offence can really put the other person on their back foot. So it might be with a deliberate provocateur. It's much better to do the subtle routes in terms of the sort of efficiency or the way in which that's likely to have an impact. In the scenario, of course, it will very much depend on the details of the scenario. So yes, I think that's my thought, really. And also, I think one thing to remember is there's third parties of two kinds. So one is other people who might have done the offensive thing themselves, who now might rethink, even if the provocateur is likely to repeat the action because that's in their nature. And the other is, of course, the effects on the third parties who are members of one's own group. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, it might be worthwhile for me to act offended to a sexist joke that I think it would be otherwise better not to act offended to, or even that I'm not offended by anymore because I've had them so often, for the sake of, say, the female graduate student and how they'll feel about what kinds of things are acceptable around here. So I think there's a sort of complex set of considerations that come into play.
So that leads on to the big question of the limits of offence and kind of appropriate offence. And so you argue that offence can be a valuable and important thing, but you also say that it is subject to limits.
Yes, of course. So one of the most important things, because the point I keep reiterating both in the work and I want to get across here, I guess, is that I do think offence is a terribly ordinary and everyday kind of emotion, right? It's not this catastrophic thing that I think it's sometimes seen as, when there's this sort of threat to social relations or we're not going to be able to continue like this. And so I think one really important distinction to make here is between public shaming on the one hand and offence on the other. And that's one of the limits on offence that I'll go through. So the thought I have is just they're not the same thing. So to publicly shame someone, you might not be offended at all. You might be angry. You might be resentful. You might not have any emotions, but just want to do what you think is the right thing, right? To contribute towards a general sense that this sort of thing might not be done anymore. So I think it's really important to keep them apart. One reason they're so distinct, I think, is that the notion of offence I have doesn't permit much pile-on type of behaviour. And the reason for that is you can only take offence on, if you like, your own behalf. To do something else is a conceptual and a moral mistake. So slight finessing of on your own behalf, that includes affronts to people like you. So if someone says a sexist joke to another woman in my office, I can also be offended because it pertains also to my standing, right? That they think that sexist jokes are acceptable, for instance. So it's kind of an affront to you or your group is what I mean. And you can only take offence to those. So the thought I have is when you see people acting as if they're offended on the part of someone else, right? So someone experiences an affront to them, which is based on some facet of their identity or social position, and someone who doesn't share that facet of identity or social position joins in, right? So piles in. They're making a conceptual and moral mistake. So the conceptual mistake is it's just not about them and their standing. They look a lot like Hume's case of the man who takes great pride in the existence of very beautiful fish in the sea. It's very confusing. Like, why would you make it about you? It's not about you. It's a fish in the sea. And likewise, why would you make this affront to standing about you? And so I think the best way to make sense of what's happening is you make it about you. And that's a moral mistake. So you would say, okay, well, this other group's being offended, but I'm such an upright person that doing that kind of offensive to other group behavior around me is unacceptable, because you should have known that I, this great person with the correct values, would have found that offensive. And that's the moral mistake, because you're taking away the attention from what's really at issue here, which is the affront to the other group, and making it about the affront to you. So that's one limit. Don't take offence on other people's behalf. And that's one reason why I don't see a tendency to public shaming in offence. I think they're two separate phenomena that get run together. So that's one limit. And another is a sort of set of things to think that obviously one's offence ought to be proportionate and proportionally expressed. So not just anything goes. You have overreacted if, when your partner says something slightly rude about your cooking, it's probably an overreaction to withdraw altogether from the relationship. So I think that, there are some kinds of settings of proportionality. It's a little bit complicated. So I don't think that rules out all grand gestures. So I actually think probably things like going on Twitter and saying, no one should accept invitations to events where this person will be present because of this hideously offensive thing they've done. I think sometimes we will see these grander gestures, and we should expect them because, if you like, the smaller gestures, the raised eyebrows, the small silences, work much better in continuing and ongoing relations than they do where you take offence at something a stranger has done, because they're not very likely to notice your small acts of withdrawal. So you'll be pushed towards bigger ones. So that's a bit, the story about what's proportionate is slightly more complicated than just thinking in terms of the particular act and the resulting action.
And just going back to the first of those limits, the idea that you can only take offence on your own behalf. So you have some quite strong words for people who might feel that they're doing something very good and important in the world. You say they're making a moral mistake. You say they're being rather self-involved. You describe them as, they're basically being rather selfish. And yet, they feel that what they're doing is standing up for really important principles of justice in society. So how can those things be reconciled?
Great. So I think, obviously, it can be very good to amplify the voices of those who are offended, to be indignant on their behalf, to feel anger towards a perpetrator. So it's not the case that I think the correct emotional response to someone having been seriously offended is, oh, it's nothing to do with me, I won't get involved. It's just that it's not to make it about oneself. So it's not to take offence, it's to do one of these other many ways in which we can involve ourselves in the interaction that's going on.
So this takes us back to that distinction that you drew earlier on between taking offence and being indignant. And you described indignation as I found it slightly curious at the time you said it. You said an impartial form of anger. But what you were thinking about is precisely this idea that it's not about you.
Yeah, right. It's about the kind of the injustice that's done in the world, right? And of course that can provoke anger. But sometimes we feel much more personal forms of anger.
clearly you're not suggesting that those of us who are not kind of directly affected, or a group that we belong to is directly affected, should just kind of do nothing when we see offensive action.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, exactly. So you might engage in other kinds of withdrawal behaviors or other kinds of engagement, right? In terms of forms of anger that you might express to that person. Yeah.
So you say that you can feel offended on your own behalf. You can feel offended in things done against another member of your group. What counts as a group here?
Great.
So I mean, I'm thinking, can humanity be a group? And can you kind of feel offended because your sense of what it is to be a human being has been offended?
So I think yes, so I think it's very context specific what counts as a group. So the humanities case, the best example I've got for that are dead baby jokes. So I think you might find those offensive because you think it's a failure to respect the sort of dignity that you take it people are owed. So I think yes, it's possible that's the relevant specification of the group, but it doesn't work everywhere, right? Not the sexist joke is not an affront to humanity itself, right? Maybe the dead baby joke is. So
why is just to be clear, why do you say that is the case? What's the basis for that distinction?
Great. So the basis for that distinction is something like you can only. So the relevant group depends on the nature of the affront and the setting that you're in. So it's slightly complicated. So the reason the dead baby joke looks like it might be something that anyone could take offence to, say not just people who have experienced baby loss or something like this, is that I take it might be an affront to the basic respect and consideration that we take it everyone is due. So something like on a certain honour for the dead, which is violated by the dead baby joke. And so that might be an affront that is offered to everybody, but not all affronts are offered to everybody. And so they can't all be seen as an affront to sort of humanity itself or to the basic dignity that humans are owed. So that's one reason why not everything should be collapsed into this kind of humanity box. In terms of which groups, it is really tricky. So I tend to think in terms of socially salient groups. So the groups is likely to reflect on your standing as you're presenting it. If someone else is affronted, if they're in a socially salient group that you're also in or taken to be in. So the thought is something like, when you're thinking about how your standing is going in this particular setting, is it likely that an affront to this other is something that also is going to be taken to reflect on you? Mm-hmm. And so socially salient groups, that would tend to be the case, right? If it's the kind of group that people tend to think matters and it's an affront to the person qua membership, because of the membership of their group in respect to their membership of a particular group, and you're in that group too, then it's going to be an affront to you. So the relevant group will depend on the affront and the setting. So different groups can be salient also in different settings. So it's a little bit tricky to sort of figure out what "and other group" means. But I think you have to be able to tell that story of connection. So why would an affront to that other be one about you? And one really easy answer is because people are going to lump me with that person by nature of this socially salient group. And so if they're put down, I also am being indirectly put down. Mm-hmm. Whereas if no one's going to perceive any connection between us, then you're not going to get that kind of transfer of standing threat.
And that sounds like a very intriguing way of putting it, because you're putting the emphasis there on kind of socially salient groups. I kind of feel a lot of what we hear at the moment is the importance people attach to their own identity and their own very particular sense of who they are. And that they feel that identity is being offended by what others are saying. So it's not that it's necessarily a socially important group that they might or may not be part of, but they have a very particular personal identity that is offended.
Good. And so I also include that. Yeah. So in the paper, I constantly talk about socially salient identities and sense of identity that you have, because of course, so what I borrow from the sociologists, the idea of face. So I take it that we present ourselves and conceive of ourselves in certain ways. So that would include these kind of identities. And that those vary across different settings. So the identity you might want to present at work may be different to the one you want to present in your personal life. You want to have different features of you, the same person. You're still the same person, but different features of your identity you want to present in certain settings. And so one way you can be affronted is by people denying you the ability to make those changes that you want to make. So for instance, if maybe as a parent, you want to present a certain set of your qualities, but you don't want those to be the ones you're presenting in the workplace. And so insofar as people sort of bring in your parenthood into the workplace, that could be something that would be offensive or an affront because they're denying you that kind of professional persona that you're trying to present in that setting. And so, yes, it will include facets of identity. So if you're conceiving of yourself in a certain way and trying to present yourself in a certain way, and another affronts you on that basis, that's a source of offence. And again, one that could be shared. So if you see that someone who's presenting the identity that you're also presenting here is affronted, that also may transfer to you.
Our time has gone incredibly quickly and we must draw this to a close. Can we just attempt to do that by going back to where we started and this idea of an epidemic of snowflakes and defense taking and all this kind of thing? What should our judgment be of claims such as those about the situation that we're in today?
So I guess two things. So one is maybe not to reach for this idea that it's an epidemic or something new, but rather to see it as a continuation of a perfectly ordinary part of the negotiation in our social relations. More concrete implications is a really good reason to move away from the hurt feelings paradigm when thinking about offence, both on the left and on the right, I think. So I think if you think offence is about hurt feelings, on the right you tend to get this kind of dismissive reaction, right? Grow a thicker skin, no longer care about these things. Your life would go better if you just didn't notice. So if I'm right, that's wrong. That's wrong because this stuff does matter. It's part of the thing that patterns relations in socially unequal ways. Of course, you should flag it and resist it. It's not good to just grow a thicker skin and ignore this stuff, at least not all the time. But on the left as well, I think sometimes there's this instinct to sort of protect against offence. So one area I'm looking at in the book is in comedy, right? So it's the thought, actually, you shouldn't have any offensive jokes. And I think that's also a mistake because it's not about hurt feelings. It's about this negotiation. And so actually, if you like, we should want the dynamics of offence to some extent to play out. And we certainly wouldn't really want third parties stepping in to prevent, sort of repress the offence and the offensive acts and push them underground, because bringing them to light and taking offence against them is probably the best way to start revising those norms. So I think both on the left and the right, there's a bit of a mistake you make if you take the hurt feelings view. So yes, I think those are the things. And I think one last thing maybe is that when you see that there's a lot of offence being taken around a particular issue, you shouldn't think it's a matter of sensitivity or fragility by that group, but rather think that here is a live issue in our social relations where it looks like the norms and practices are in the process of being renegotiated. So it's a slightly different take on what might be going on there.
Well, thank you. This has been so thought-provoking. I always love it when we have political philosophers on because I get a real kind of brain workout, and this has just been great. So thank you so much, Emily. The article we've been talking about is called Taking Offence, An Emotion Reconsidered, published in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs last year. We'll put those details on the show notes for this episode, and we'll also look out for the book when that comes out, and maybe we can have you on again, Emily, to explore these matters further. Next week, though, we're looking at the motivations of bureaucrats and more broadly at how the work of political scientists can achieve real-world policy impact. As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.